Unity of Houston is an inclusive church where we seek to understand and live the teachings of Jesus and other spiritual masters. At Unity, we welcome all people from all spiritual paths and every walk of life. We celebrate the diversity of our city and of our world, and we teach love, tolerance, and oneness, seeking to live in harmony with open minds and open hearts.
Wherever you are in your spiritual path, you are always welcome at Unity. Join us and discover that the life of your dreams is already within you. How many of you have experienced that, where the greatest disappointments and trials actually ended up being some of the most beautiful blessings in your life? If you know that? Yeah, there's a joke that we sometimes tell around here that religious people believe in hell and spiritual people have been there. You know. But there's something, she kind of gave my message. Today, it's Palm Sunday, and so if we're going to celebrate the resurrection next Sunday, we have to talk about the crucifixion. If we're going to talk about life after death, we have to talk about death. My old minister, she's not old, but my minister in Dallas for many years, who's my teacher in this movement for, the 17 years I was there, she would do a whole series on sex and spirituality, and the place would be packed. And in the middle, throw in a sermon on illness and death, just to kind of get the people there. You don't advertise it. But this is my death talk, so just so you know. But don't worry. There are three things I want to tell you about it today. I'm a big fan of the three-point sermon. My first point today is that, don't worry, nobody dies. The spiritual and philosophical ground upon which we stand says that we are eternal, deathless, birthless, changeless beings who have taken this temporary experience of humanity, but who we are is eternal. The second point I want to tell you is everybody dies. The human experience means that we have a beginning and an end. These bodies are temporary, so we all die. And we want to make room for that human experience of loss within our very profoundly spiritual and eternal lives. And then the third, I want to go metaphysical on you, if you'll let me, is talk about this idea of death and rebirth as the way that spiritual evolution happens. Everything dies, and everything is reborn in us. We die many deaths, and we have many resurrections, and that is the way of it. So we have to talk a little bit about what we would call the afterlife. Every spiritual tradition, it seems, has an answer, and some are very specific on what happens, and none of them agree with each other. Have you noticed that? Either this is a testing ground where you go to a good place, you go to a bad place, or else you work off karma. We don't know. But Stephen Fry, the English comedian, he was in Salt Lake City, and he was being given a tour of Temple Square and all the buildings. They were also giving him some of the Mormon theology around it, and the lady who was leading the tour said, and in the afterlife, you're reunited with your entire family for eternity. And Stephen says, what happens if you're good? He was then released from the tour at that point. So I want to talk for a moment about why we say there is no death. Before we do that, I want to acknowledge someone who has had what we sometimes call a transition, someone who has completed her human life, and a great friend of this church, Barbara Marks Hubbard. She is a futurist, just a big thinker about what's possible for humanity. She spoke here, just a dear, dear friend of this movement, and she said this about what this human lifetime, what it means. She says, everything you do counts forever. You are an expression of a whole process of creation. You are a co-creator. Thank you, Barbara. That is big picture right there. And that's what we're talking about. When I say nobody dies, that means that you are you're an expression of an infinitely creative and intelligent system, a beingness, a presence that is God, is the biggest word I know to describe the totality of all that exists, that is alive and creative and moving. You're that. That's who you are. In the title today is Death, Where Is Thy Sting? Some people thought I was quoting Shakespeare, but it's actually the prophet Hosea from the Hebrew Bible that Paul was quoting in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians. And in the passage in chapter 15, he's talking about his own understanding of life and death and what happens. And he says that, make no mistake, that which is perishable will take on that which is immortal. I think, and then he later says, this quotes Isaiah first, he says that death has been swallowed in victory. And then in Hosea, he quotes that, it says, death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory? That if we have a spiritual understanding, even though in New Thought we would probably say it just the opposite of Paul. Paul says that the perishable has clothed itself in the imperishable. What we would say is that we are the imperishable, the immortal, the deathless, birthless, changeless, but we have clothed ourselves in a human experience for a time. And there will come a time when we, as though we would remove an article of clothing, we will lay our body down. We will be complete here. But there is no sting in death from a spiritual perspective for us. That we are moving on. We were before we got here, and we will be after we leave. Now, if you're a scientific-minded person and you're looking for proof of the afterlife, I can't help you. But there sure are a lot of tantalizing breadcrumbs that God is leaving for us. How many of you remember the series that Reverend Howard did, I think 3 years ago, right around this time, on Anita Moorjani's book, Dying to Be Me? He did a 3-part series on life after death, and in Anita's wonderful book, she was definitely a spiritual skeptic, and she was dying of cancer when she had this near-death experience. And I remember the part that really, we had her on this stage for a conference we did 2 years ago, and the thing that really amazed me, she talked about meeting her father. Now, her father, she had had a troubled relationship with him, and she described their meeting that he had no gender. I mean, there was no face, there was no name. She just recognized the energy pattern that was her father, and there was no more conflict or judgment or criticism, just nothing but love. But she knew it was the spirit that was her father, and how that knowing was so deep and powerful within herself. She came out of that experience, healed her body of the cancer, and was forever changed, had lost all fear of death, and now travels the world speaking about who we truly are as spiritual beings. Another breadcrumb. I once had an experience of being in the western coast of France, and I remember it was in November, and I was walking along the ancient seawall there, and I had this thought, I've been here before. Not like deja vu, like this feels familiar, like I've been here before. And I thought, I know what the curve of the coastline looks like once I turn around go around the corner of this wall, and I did. I curved, and it was exactly, I knew it. I knew what it was going to look like, and it did. I don't know exactly what that means, but something in me is bigger than this body. 2 years ago, my father died after a battle with Alzheimer's, and it was tough. I know many of you shared your similar stories of losing a family member to that disease, and just seeing someone slowly say goodbye. And I got the call on a Friday afternoon. I was in a workshop over in the museum district, and my brother called and said, you need to come home. This looks like the end. And so we all gathered, and it was actually Sunday night when he transitioned, and we were gathered around his bed. And I think about this a lot, because it was my brother and myself, my uncle, my dad's sister, my aunt, and my mom, and my oldest niece. And the men left after a while, because we were waiting for a while, and so the three of us men, we went back. I think we were watching a Cowboys game. And then, but the women stayed, like on the story that comes to us about Easter morning, it was the women who attended the tomb. And I think I've shared with you many times how I grew up Pentecostal, and those people pray really loud. Did you know that? For me, it's kind of normal, but there was a lot of praying going on in that room where my dad was. And then at some point with the women there, it changed. I heard my mother's voice change, and it became this jubilant, it's really hard to describe. I said in that first service she was singing, but she wasn't singing. But it was, what she kept saying was, worthy is the Lamb, worthy is the Lamb. And tears just pouring. So that's what we came back in, and my dad had just crossed over. And what she described, she had no memory of exactly what happened, but she felt this eternal joy move through her body. She said she felt the angels welcoming him home. It was powerful. I don't think she made that up. I don't know what it means. But all this to say, in my heart of hearts, I believe that we go on when we die. I believe that there is a journey that we have all of eternity to discover more of who we are in God. And so, death, where is your sting, truly? There is nothing in this life that will limit who we truly are. And I think about that as being, I don't know why I think of it like this. This is our spiritual eternal life, and it holds all of our human experience. That no matter how difficult and how much we struggle in this human lifetime, that we are held forever in the truth of who we are. Someone once said that my spirit doesn't live inside my body lives inside my spirit. If you think about that, that'll blow your head off, just telling you. That we are trans-dimensional beings, existing everywhere at all times. And yet we have tuned into this frequency called human lifetime. Which brings me to my second point, which is that everyone dies. What we don't want to do, and you need to hear me, we don't want to take that spiritual truth and somehow gloss over the pain of human loss. That does not work. What we do instead is we create a space of such faith and knowing in our eternality that we can then be free to fully face and experience human life and loss. Think about it. Which is more spiritual? When someone who has just received, like my parents were married for 55 years, you imagine a loss like that. Which is more spiritual? To say to someone who has experienced that loss, he didn't really die. Or to say, I'm here with you. I feel your pain. We think we're being spiritual when we shield ourselves from the pains of our human experiences. We are not. The Buddha had a teaching called the Five Remembrances. It's one of the most ancient of the sutras in the Buddhist tradition, and this was said to have come from his very mouth. There are 5 things we are to remember. I am of the nature to grow ill, I will become ill. I am of the nature to grow old, I will grow old. I am of the nature to die, I will die. Everything that I have known and loved will be taken from me. All I possess are my actions. That is a bummer. Aren't you glad you go to Unity and you're not Buddhist? I mean, come on. It's pointing us somewhere. It's pointing us to the fact that it is our resistance to the human experience which blocks our spirituality. When we...
I can't search the web on Apple Watch.
I don't know why my Apple Watch is talking to me right now. I said experience. She thought I said Siri. Okay. Dad? That if we're willing to bring our whole heart to our human experience, no matter what happens, we are deepened, expanded, grown. We are not made less or diminished by that experience. We are made more. And this is what you need to hear. Unity has sometimes gotten this is probably our chief criticism that we get from the world of religious thinking, is that we don't have a good answer for human suffering. Because sometimes what we do is what's called the spiritual bypass. Well, it's not really happening anyway. Don't you know who you are? Can you feel how off-putting that is? That when someone is experiencing cancer, when they're experiencing a death, when they're experiencing a financial collapse, to be able to say, well, that's not real. There's nothing compassionate or loving in that. But if we can be with someone who is suffering, wow. And all the time holding it in this deeper spiritual understanding. We are meant to experience life fully. There's one of my favorite stories about Jesus of Nazareth comes in the Gospel of John. Another resurrection story, if you've read it before or you know about it. Many of us grew up in the tradition. We heard these stories our whole lives, that Jesus' dear friend Lazarus had been ill and he had died and was in the tomb. Jesus was late, and his sister Martha said, well, if you had just gotten here earlier, I'm sure you could have healed him. Now, if there's ever anybody who walked this earth who knew the spiritual truth and yet still showed us how to be in the human experience. If you read to the end of that story, Jesus said, move the stone away, Lazarus come forth, and his body was reanimated and walked out. That's the way the story goes. Before that part is what I want to talk about right now. Jesus arrives and people are in grief. They're in pain from this loss of this beloved soul that they have loved who is no longer living. And what was Jesus' response to the people? Did he say, don't worry, I got this. I got a trick up my sleeve. Wait. It's the shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35. Those of you who know the Bible, tell me what it says. Jesus wept. What we are called to in the face of human suffering is to respond with our human hearts as well as our spiritual knowing. This is who we are called to be. Not to gloss over it, to pretend it's not happening, but to be present. Loss is inevitable, and the only way through loss is grief. Did you hear me? The only way through loss is grief. And you will not be made less by this experience. Somebody asked me once, what is the work of grief? I'm doing the work of my grieving. What does that mean? Well, my teacher told me it's just feeling our sadness. That's really what it is. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who really was one of the pioneers in grief study and teaching on grief, she says this, the most beautiful people we know are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and deep loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. Your grief does not belittle the relationships that we have with those who have died. It enhances it. It's a form of love. We don't get to the end of the 5 stages like, well, that's done. I'm done grieving. Someone described it as like a person who had lost a child said, how will you ever heal that hole in your heart? She said, I will never heal the hole in my heart. But my heart is growing larger around that hole. My grandmother died when I was 12. Nobody has ever loved me like that. I don't know if some of you grandmas, you know, the way you love those babies, there's nothing like it. One of the hints I have that something is still happening beyond this life is that in some of the darkest, most difficult times in my life, I felt her presence and her love was real with me. I miss her. She died 40 years ago. I still long for her presence. My grief for that amazing woman has not kept me small. It has grown me and expanded me, and it has kept my heart tender and open. That is the point of allowing ourselves to grieve. So finally, what is the metaphysical meaning of this death and resurrection story? Now, you have to come back next week because that's when we give you the really good stuff on this one, okay? But I'm going to give you a hint, a little preview. The spiritual journey is always one of dying to the former and being resurrected into the new. This is the journey. There is really no escaping it, and you don't want to. We all come into this life in particular families that have particular belief systems, and they just get installed. Have you noticed? Families have beliefs around scarcity, around who are the good people, who are the not good people, all of these things that we have, and our cultures do too. We inherit what the old metaphysicians called race consciousness. It has nothing to do with ethnicity, but the human consciousness of limitation. And we all get downloads of what that is, and it's false. We get false and limited ideas, belief structures, identities. And in order for us to be on a spiritual journey and to heal and to become more of who God has called us to be, we have to let things die. And it can be painful, or at least uncomfortable, when the very way you've come to identify yourself, you realize now is false. And something must be released so something new can come. So many of you are in that journey. All of you are in that journey. You're either in a Jerusalem experience, a tomb experience, or maybe it is Easter morning in your life, praise God. But we are always in that journey somewhere. And if we're willing to, if we're willing to be willing, honestly, that's what it is. The DNA of the universe is so right on, so wise, so intelligent. All we really have to do is stop trying to figure it out and let life move through us fully, completely, wholly, and we are lifted and carried through all of these experiences and brought around to be who we exactly are. This is the Easter message. First Corinthians, a little bit before the death where is thy sting verse in chapter 15, verse 35, Paul writes, "But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? How foolish," he says, "what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you plant, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or something else, and God gives it a body as he has determined, and to each kind of seed he gives its own body." If you plant a wheat seed into the soil, that seed must give up its very existence. It must give up its form. It must die to what it is so that something new can be born. This is what is seeking to happen in your life today. There is a seed of resurrection in your pain and in your smallness. And if you're willing to allow life to move through you, to surrender, to let go and let God, then the resurrection possibilities are limitless for you. You are more than you know yourself to be. How do I know that? Because someone stood on a stage and pointed at me and told me that. And I chose to believe it. And it's still true. If no one has told you today that they love you, I love you. You are amazing. Something is truly happening here, and it is the resurrection of God's people. I can see it in you. God bless you. Thank you for watching this message today. I'd like to invite you to join us in person here on campus at Unity of Houston for Sunday morning or Wednesday evening services. If you can't be with us here on our campus, you can still join us live on Facebook or on our website, unityhouston.org, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. Central.